I knew he was having some health issues, and I was really concerned about him, but he would look at me every day and say, "I'm good."
At dawn, on August 9th, 2008, the ICU Chicago, cold white lights cast down on a motionless body lying in a hospital bed. A 50-year-old man. No words, no movement. Only the dry mechanical rhythm of a heart monitor breaking the silence, punctuated by the sound of doctors' shoes hitting the floor, short, hurried, and heavy. That man had once made all of America laugh simply by stepping onto a stage. His laughter was not refined, not polite, it erupted raw and unapologetic. A man whose every sentence could make an entire room explode with joy. Bernie Mac, a symbol of boundless energy, of laughter that never seemed to tire. But now, everything was silent. That body no longer responded. No stage lights, no applause, only a cold, incomprehensible stillness, frightening in its emptiness where laughter once lived. Between those two opposing moments, there were 24 hours that passed unseen by the public. What really happened in the final 24 hours of Bernie Mac's life? Closing a legend. When Bernie Mac was transferred to the intensive care unit at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, there were no flashing cameras following behind, no press release, no television lenses, only a medical chart being opened thick, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. In the world of doctors and nurses, Bernie Mac was no longer a comedy icon who had generated hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office. No longer the star of The Bernie Mac Show, which ran for 104 episodes over 5 seasons. He was a 50-year-old male patient admitted to the ICU with severe pulmonary infection requiring continuous respiratory support. The official cause of death, later confirmed by both the hospital and the family, was concise complications from pneumonia. No asterisks, no footnotes, no criminal or abnormal factors were recorded. The time of death was determined to be the early morning of August 9, 2008. A quiet ending, almost disproportionate to the stature of a man who had made America laugh for more than 3 decades. According to treatment records, Bernie Mac was admitted in late July 2008 after developing severe respiratory infection symptoms. His condition quickly surpassed the threshold of standard treatment, forcing doctors to transfer him directly to the ICU. There, Bernie was intubated and placed on mechanical ventilation to maintain oxygen levels. His lungs were documented as being in an acute inflammatory state, responding poorly to initial treatment. His vital signs required 24/7 monitoring through specialized systems machines that made no sound yet, whose every flicker carried life or death significance. In the records, there is no line describing emotion. No wording speaks of fear, hope, or pain. Only data: pulmonary infection, declining respiratory function, mechanical support required. Bernie Mac was administered broad-spectrum antibiotics according to ICU protocol. Alongside this were blood pressure support medications, sedatives, and standard interventions for critically ill patients. One important detail clearly documented in the medical records was a history of sarcoidosis, a rare chronic inflammatory disease that Bernie Mac had lived with for more than 25 years. According to confirmation from both family and treating physicians, the condition was in remission at the time of his admission. However, long-term management of sarcoidosis meant that Bernie Mac had previously and intermittently used immunosuppressive medication. This was listed in the records as part of his medical history, not as an unexpected event. There is no note stating that sarcoidosis was the cause of death. On paper, the disease appears only as background data, mandatory medical information required when building a treatment plan, much like age, past smoking history, or prior hospitalizations. All are listed without interpretation or speculation. Notably, in Bernie Mac's case, there was no publicly conducted autopsy in the traditional sense. No widely released autopsy report. The medical reason was straightforward. The cause of death had been fully determined through prolonged treatment, clinical testing, and direct ICU monitoring. For physicians, this death raised no unanswered questions requiring further surgical examination. Instead, the full picture was constructed from 3 primary sources: treatment records, official medical statements, and hospital reports. These documents are not meant for public consumption, yet they were sufficient for authorities and family members to reach a final conclusion. In subsequent statements, Bernie Mac's representative emphasized that he died from pneumonia and that sarcoidosis was not the direct cause. Northwestern Memorial Hospital released no information contradicting this conclusion. The numbers that appear repeatedly in the records: oxygen saturation, heart rate, blood pressure, duration of mechanical ventilation, all point to a single reality. Bernie Mac's body required maximal medical support in his final days. He did not die at home. Not suddenly. Not in a single unexpected moment. He passed away within the most tightly controlled environment of modern medicine, where even the smallest change is recorded as data. And it is precisely this cold precision that makes Bernie Mac's medical records unsettling. Because across dozens of pages and screens filled with numbers, there is no place for fame, no space for artistic legacy. There is only a body fighting infection hour by hour. A man over 6 feet tall who once stood unshaken before thousands, now described in impersonal lines identical to any other ICU patient. There is no line in the records calling him a legend, but it is the absence of such a line that chills the spine. Because medicine does not care who Bernie Mac was. It only records what happened. These numbers do not tell a story, but they are the only things that do not lie. 3 decades of laughter on stage. 25 years of endurance and silence. Before the hospital room closed behind Bernie Mac, before medical numbers began to replace laughter, his body had already endured a quiet battle that lasted for decades. A battle most audiences never saw. Bernie Mac was not a man who collapsed suddenly. He was a man who had held himself upright for far too long. In 1983, when Bernie Mac was just in his early 20s and still struggling to find a foothold in Chicago's comedy scene, he was diagnosed with sarcoidosis, a rare chronic inflammatory disease that can attack the lungs, lymph nodes, and other organs. For many, such a diagnosis would mean a complete change in lifestyle. For Bernie Mac, it became a secret he carried throughout his career. He rarely spoke about his illness on stage, and when he did, he turned it into a joke. But in real life, sarcoidosis was anything but funny. For 25 years, the disease never disappeared. It only shifted states, flaring up, subsiding, smoldering beneath the surface. Bernie Mac lived with prolonged fatigue, persistent coughing, sudden shortness of breath. There were periods when the disease progressed severely enough that he required long-term medication to control the inflammatory response in his body. Even when the illness was later confirmed to be in remission, its traces remained in his lungs, in his stamina, in his ability to recover. What matters is this: Bernie Mac never slowed his life because of the disease. On the contrary, he moved faster. From the late 1990s into the early 2000s, Bernie Mac's career entered an explosive phase. He was no longer just a stand-up comedian, but a fully realized entertainment brand. The original kings of comedy brought his name to audiences across America. The Bernie Mac Show premiered in 2001 and quickly became one of Fox's most successful sitcoms, running 5 seasons with 104 episodes. At the same time came film roles: Ocean's 11, Bad Santa, Guess Who, Mr. 3000. Year after year, Bernie Mac appeared in major projects. His schedule left almost no empty space. Days were spent filming the sitcom at an intense pace. Nights were for recording, writing, rehearsing. Between TV seasons came feature films. When movies hit theaters, he went straight into promotion talk shows, live comedy stages. To audiences, Bernie Mac looked tireless. Behind the scenes, his body was paying the price. In 2004, reality finally forced itself into the open. During production of The Bernie Mac Show, Bernie was suddenly hospitalized with severe pneumonia, accompanied by total physical exhaustion. Fox was forced to halt production for nearly a month, a rare and costly decision for a hit sitcom. Press releases at the time used gentle language: exhaustion, need for rest. In truth, Bernie Mac had collapsed because his body could no longer carry the load. Those who worked closely with him recalled that Bernie coughed constantly, breathed heavily, and often had to sit down mid-scene just to catch his breath. But the moment the camera rolled, he stood up, flashed his familiar smile, and continued performing as if nothing were wrong. That was the first time the entertainment industry was forced to admit Bernie Mac was not a machine. Alongside illness, there was another factor that had worn down his lungs over many years: cigarettes. Bernie Mac had been a heavy smoker in his youth. He later admitted that he smoked for years, until one night a violent coughing fit left him feeling as if he were about to suffocate. That moment drove him to quit smoking entirely in the mid-1990s. But like sarcoidosis, the damage from smoking did not vanish simply because he stopped. Once lungs are harmed, they do not return to their original state. Over time, signs of decline became increasingly visible, though few noticed. Bernie Mac often breathed heavily during long conversations, pausing mid-sentence to take deep breaths. He tired more quickly than before, though he tried to hide it. On long shooting days, he sometimes left the set in silence without his usual joking. To outsiders, it looked like age. To his body, it was a warning. By 2007, while his career was still at its peak, Bernie Mac surprised many by publicly considering early retirement. In one conversation, he said he wanted to live for himself to step away while he was still remembered at his best. Many dismissed it as an offhand remark from a successful star. In hindsight, it sounded more like a confession than a plan. Bernie Mac understood his body better than anyone. He knew he had been running too long. He knew that every burst of laughter on stage was paid for with real energy. He knew illness does not disappear simply because it is ignored. But like so many artists, he kept stepping onto the stage not because he wasn't afraid, but because he didn't want to stop. There was no single moment of collapse in this story, only small fractures appearing gradually over the years. A body carrying too much chronic illness, old damage, professional pressure, a relentless schedule, all of it layered together quietly, persistently. Bernie Mac did not break down in one day. His body had been exhausted for a very long time. 24 hours before everything slipped out of reach. The morning of August 8, 2008 began, much like many other mornings during the weeks Bernie Mac had been hospitalized. There was no sudden incident, no major warning signs. His vital parameters were recorded within a controllable range. His body temperature was slightly above normal, but not enough to trigger alarms. Blood oxygen levels were maintained with respiratory support, not improving significantly, but not sharply declining either. For the medical team, it was a day of continued monitoring. Throughout the afternoon, Bernie's condition remained largely unchanged. He lay still, minimally responsive, fully dependent on life support systems. Tests were repeated according to schedule. No new decisions were made. No one in the hospital viewed this as a turning point. Everything resembled an extended phase of waiting. By early afternoon, the numbers began to fluctuate. Body temperature rose mildly but steadily. Doctors noted that the fever did not spike suddenly, but increased in small increments. At the same time, blood oxygen levels showed a downward trend despite ongoing support. His lungs were responding less effectively than in previous days. There were no signs of improvement following standard interventions. These changes were enough to be noted, but not enough to trigger an alarm. Toward late afternoon, the indicators continued drifting in the same direction. The fever did not subside. Oxygen requirements increased just to maintain minimum levels. Tests showed the infection was still not under control. There was no breakthrough, no bright spot, only a series of numbers slowly worsening. By early evening, the medical team made the decision to call the family in. This was not an emergency notification, but it was no longer a reassuring update. Bernie Mac was classified as a patient with unfavorable progression. His wife and daughter arrived at the hospital after nightfall. No one spoke it aloud, but the atmosphere in the room was different from previous visits. In the hours that followed, Bernie's condition became increasingly unpredictable. The numbers were unstable, fluctuating within a narrow range, but without pause. There was no stretch long enough to be considered stable. Every adjustment was merely supportive. There was no clear response. Time moved slowly in the intensive care unit, where the lights never turn off. As night deepened, the parameters crossed thresholds considered safe. Body temperature rose more rapidly. Oxygen levels dropped below acceptable limits despite increased support. His lungs no longer responded as before. At this point, Bernie Mac's status was officially shifted from critical to red alert. Doctors began staying closer at hand. Brief, urgent exchanges took place outside the room. There was no shouting, no panic. Only intense focus and the sensation that time was being compressed. The clock in the ICU room continued to run normally. But for those present, each minute began to carry a different weight. No one in that room knew that the clock had already begun to run backward. All choices came to an end. There was no verbal warning, just a subtle change on the monitoring screen, something only ICU staff would immediately recognize. A heart rhythm that had already been fragile suddenly became erratic, then abruptly flattened into a straight line. The familiar sound rang out sharp and final. Code blue. The room moments ago silent instantly came alive. The door opened. Medical staff appeared almost simultaneously, each moving into their assigned position. Bernie Mac lay motionless on the bed, unresponsive. His heart had stopped. There was no screaming, no chaos. Every action followed procedures practiced hundreds of times. Chest compressions began. Equipment was connected. Short commands echoed through the room. For those standing in the hallway, time seemed to stretch unnaturally. Bernie's wife and daughter were asked to leave the room. The door closed in front of them. No one said much. There was nothing to do but wait. After long, heavy minutes, a heartbeat reappeared on the monitor. Not strong, not stable, but enough to be called a pulse. Doctors continued life support, trying to hold on to a rhythm pulled back from the final edge. One physician stepped outside and briefly informed the family that the heart had restarted. No one used the words out of danger, only temporarily stable. Bernie Mac was returned to close monitoring. The room grew quieter again. The machines continued their work. A heartbeat remained on the screen, but no one considered it a victory. This was only a pause, fragile, brief, and uncertain. In that silence, there were no long conversations. No one left their post. The doctors knew Bernie Mac's body had just suffered a major shock, and that any change could be the last. The family was allowed to see him from a distance. No words, no movement, only waiting in silence. Then what no one hoped for happened a second time. The monitor changed again. The heart rhythm faltered, then vanished. Code blue once more. There was no longer surprise, only a heavy urgency. The procedures were repeated exactly as before, but the atmosphere had shifted. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood Bernie Mac's body was no longer capable of returning as it had the first time. Resuscitation efforts continued. Every permissible option was exhausted. Time passed. The heartbeat did not return. Vital signs failed to respond. Finally, a decision was made, not from lack of effort, but because there were no medically reasonable options left. The intervention stopped. The sounds in the room faded. A doctor looked at the clock and read the time of death. The moment was not dramatic. There was no music, only the absolute silence of a room that had just lost a life. The family was called in. There was no lengthy explanation, only the truth spoken simply. Bernie Mac was gone. There are moments when medicine no longer has the right to choose. No signs of a cover-up. After all procedures were completed and the records were closed, the story of Bernie Mac appeared complete. The cause of death was clear. The final course had been confirmed. Yet when the timelines are placed side by side, gaps still exist, not enough to fuel sensational suspicion, but enough to make one pause and ask what was not fully documented. First is the point of hospital admission. Some early reports suggested that Bernie Mac was hospitalized in early August 2008. Later statements from the family and the hospital, however, indicated that he had been receiving treatment since late July, and had even spent time in the ICU before the media was informed. This discrepancy of several days does not change the medical conclusion, but it creates a blur in the public timeline, a space where the public does not know exactly what condition Bernie was in when the hospital doors closed behind him. Next is the difference between what was publicly communicated and the reality inside the ICU. In his final days, updates released to the outside world repeatedly used phrases such as stable recovering and responding to treatment. These terms were not incorrect in a technical sense, but they also did not fully convey the severity of a patient who required mechanical ventilation and continuous intensive monitoring. The gap between medical language and public understanding inadvertently created the impression that things were better than they truly were. Another detail that was only confirmed after Bernie Mac's death was the presence of a second infection during the course of treatment. This information was not widely disclosed at the time, and the records do not clearly specify when the new infection emerged. This is not uncommon in an ICU environment where patients undergo prolonged invasive interventions, but the absence of a precise timeline makes the progression of the illness difficult to reconstruct in full. There is also the prolonged period during which Bernie Mac was unconscious. The records note that he was deeply sedated for much of his treatment, but they do not clearly identify the moments when he may have been awake, aware, or able to communicate. The family only knew that there were brief periods of weak response, followed by a long stretch of complete silence. What occurred during that time within Bernie's own awareness is something no one can answer with certainty. And finally, there are the things the records do not capture. Medical charts document numbers, medications, and timestamps. They do not record the brief conversations in hallways, the exchanged glances between doctors, or the shift in atmosphere when a case moves from hope to caution. These elements do not appear in any official report, yet they exist in the lived reality of those present. There is no evidence of error, no sign of concealment, only the natural gaps of a complex medical process, one in which not every detail is or can be recorded. Not every question has an answer, and medicine is no exception. Emergency alert, where there is no way out. In the ICU, there are no alarms for emotions, only protocol. When code blue is activated, everything operates like a pre-programmed machine. It is not a panicked reaction, but the response of a system accustomed to standing at the boundary between life and death. The patient room door opens. Medical staff arrive from multiple directions, each taking their assigned position. No questions, no explanations required. Inside the room, only those with a defined role are allowed to remain. The critical care physician, ICU nurses, technicians. There is no space for hesitation, no room for personal emotion. Bernie Mac lies at the center of the room, surrounded by equipment, tubing, and monitors. In that moment, he is no longer an individual patient, but the focal point of a collective effort. Outside, his family is asked to step away. Not because they are untrusted, but because the ICU does not permit the presence of non-essential individuals when an emergency system is in motion. Bernie's wife and daughter remain in the hallway under harsh white lights with nowhere to sit. No one tells them exactly what is happening inside the room. They only know that the most critical decisions are being made behind a closed door. The sensation of waiting in moments like these is unlike any other kind of waiting. There is no timeline, no countdown clock. Each passing minute carries a weight that cannot be measured. No one speaks. No one dares to ask. Every sound in the hallway, footsteps, rolling carts, whispered voices, becomes painfully distinct. When resuscitation efforts end, there is no advance signal, no dramatic announcement. Only the door opening and a doctor stepping out with a face that needs no further explanation. In the ICU, outcomes are never prolonged with words. They are communicated through brevity. The family is called in. There is no longer movement from machines, no blinking rhythm on the monitors. The room becomes unnervingly still. Those who have just exerted every effort withdraw quietly, leaving space for the final truth. No one speaks much. No one tries to soften the moment with hollow consolations. In the ICU, everything has a protocol, even the end. When a life can no longer be sustained, the system shifts into another state: documentation, confirmation, closure. There are no sirens, no chaos, no crowd. Only a room that has just lost its life. And those who remain must learn how to walk out carrying what has just happened. When the story left the ICU and was rewritten. During the days Bernie Mac lay in the hospital, the outside world never saw the numbers on the monitoring screens. What they received instead were brief news items, carefully polished updates enough to reassure, but not enough to reflect the full reality. The phrase that appeared most often in the press at the time was "in stable condition." A safe, neutral phrase, one that easily led readers to believe everything was moving in the right direction. The truth is that stable in the language of media does not mean safe in reality. But that gap is rarely explained. To the public, Bernie Mac was still fighting and had a chance to recover. To friends and colleagues, it was a reason to breathe a sigh of relief. Even within the entertainment industry, many believed he simply needed more time to rest. No one prepared themselves for a different ending. Then rumors began to surface. Before August 9th, reports had already spread online claiming that Bernie Mac had died. Some sites rushed to publish sensational headlines. The family and his representatives were forced to deny them. The denials came quickly, but the damage remained. The rumors pushed the story in a different direction, no longer about health, but about confusion. The public no longer knew what to believe, and the information gap was quickly filled with speculation. When Bernie Mac did pass away, another misunderstanding immediately appeared and spread. Sarcoidosis was assumed to be the cause of death. It was a simple interpretation, easy to turn into a headline, but one that distorted the story. Many articles hastily linked Bernie Mac's death to the rare disease he had publicly discussed in the past, ignoring the actual context of his final days. Only later did corrections appear, quieter, less visible, and often no longer in headline position. The way media operates is not malicious. It operates on speed. In that cycle, complex details have no place. A story needs a clear cause, an easy conclusion, a headline strong enough to hold attention. Bernie Mac, in the final moments of his life, became a victim of that very mechanism. His story was condensed, framed, and retold in the most convenient way for those far removed from it. To the public, Bernie Mac's death was news. To his family, it was an experience stretched over weeks and months, with each hour passing in tension and helplessness. Those two realities do not align, yet they were merged into one on the page. Headlines made it feel sudden and abrupt, while the reality was a long, exhausting, and emotionally draining process. When a story is retold enough times, it begins to take on a life of its own. People remember the media version more than what actually happened inside the ICU room. And that is when the distance between truth and perception becomes most apparent. The world knows Bernie Mac through the news, but the news was never inside the ICU room, when the body no longer has the strength to save itself. At the end of every debate, medicine does not seek drama. It seeks chains of cause and effect. In Bernie Mac's case, the final conclusion does not lie in a single moment, but in the gradual way his body lost the ability to defend itself until it no longer had the strength to continue. It all began with pneumonia. By nature, pneumonia is an infection of the lungs that causes the air sacs where oxygen exchange occurs to become inflamed and filled with fluid and pus. When this happens, oxygen can no longer enter the bloodstream effectively. The body responds by breathing faster and forcing the heart to beat harder to compensate for the oxygen deficit. In a healthy person, this mechanism can be sustained for a certain period of time, but it is not a state that can last indefinitely. When pneumonia becomes severe, respiratory failure sets in. The lungs can no longer perform their function, forcing medicine to intervene with mechanical support. But machines only replace part of that function. They do not heal inflamed lung tissue. They merely prevent the body from collapsing immediately. In Bernie Mac's case, the body's ability to withstand stress had already been compromised. Immunosuppressive medications necessary to control chronic disease simultaneously weakened the body's natural defenses. Under normal conditions, the immune system identifies and destroys invading bacteria. When that system is suppressed, bacteria gain the advantage. They multiply faster, persist longer, and become harder to eliminate. Pneumonia in that context was no longer a simple infection. It became a prolonged assault, one in which the body was forced to fight without adequate weapons. Antibiotics could slow the process, but if lung tissue had already been severely damaged and the inflammatory response had spread, the effectiveness of treatment diminished over time. When infection persists, the consequences extend beyond the lungs. Bacteria and inflammatory mediators can enter the bloodstream, leading to systemic infection. At that point, other organs begin to suffer. The heart must work harder to compensate for oxygen loss. The kidneys are strained by blood pressure changes and toxins. The liver must process unusually large amounts of medication. This is the pathway toward multi-organ failure, a cascade that modern medicine still finds extremely difficult to reverse once it begins. Many people ask, how could a 50-year-old man still working and still appearing in public fail to survive pneumonia? The answer lies in this reality. Biological age does not always match the number on paper. Bernie Mac's body had endured years of chronic illness, residual damage, and relentless workload. When pneumonia struck, it did not attack a healthy 50-year-old body, but one whose biological reserves had already been depleted over time. Medicine calls this loss of compensatory capacity. When one system in the body falters, others step in to maintain balance. But when reserves are exhausted, collapse happens rapidly. Not because treatment was wrong, not because a critical moment was missed, but because there was no strength left to recover. In the final medical record, there is no sign of a clear medical error. No single decision is identified as the cause. There is only a chain of biological events unfolding according to their own rules, cold, logical, and unforgiving. Bernie Mac did not die because of a mistake. He died because his body no longer had the strength to fight. Questions without answers. After all the facts have been laid out, there are still questions left behind. Not questions meant to assign blame, but ones that force us to confront the fragility of fate itself. If Bernie Mac had rested earlier, would his body have had more time to recover? If he had not needed powerful medications to control a chronic illness, would his immune system have been strong enough to fight the infection? If a second infection had never appeared, might the battle have ended differently? And if his body had not already carried underlying disease, would pneumonia have been such a severe sentence? None of these questions are meant to accuse anyone. They exist because humans are instinctively drawn to search for a turning point, a moment when everything might have gone another way. But medicine does not operate on hypotheticals, and neither does life. Every what-if is only a slice of imagination incapable of reversing what has already happened. No hypothesis can bring Bernie back, but each question is still worth contemplating. Bernie Mac spent his entire life making others laugh loudly, unapologetically, without hiding who he was. Yet his final moments unfolded in a silent room, with no audience, no spotlight, and no applause echoing in the air. His death was not loud, not scandalous, not wrapped in prolonged controversy. It came quietly, much like the way his body had been wearing down for many years. Bernie Mac's legacy does not lie in the tragedy of his final days, but in the thousands of hours of laughter he gave to the world, and in the quiet warning about human limits, even for the strongest among us. The world thinks it lost Bernie Mac in a single night. The truth is, it lost him little by little over many years.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast.
There is still so much more to explore. Stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now during on your screen.